My name is Camille Palmer, and this is my evidence of preparation through talking to the text. The first thing that I reacted to was in the LRC on page 24, and it was the definition of authoritativeness. I said that this can happen a lot with informative texts. I used to hate them because of this. I really used to hate reading informational text because I just always felt like the language was way too stuffy, and so being able to put a word to that feeling that I had really resonated with me. The second thing that I reacted to was on page 25 of the LRC. It was a sentence that said, "The fact that language in informational text seems foreign to many students is not helped by the low prevalence of informational text in most classrooms, especially in the primary grades." I did a question mark there and I said, "It seems like kids want fiction more. How do we get them to want nonfiction?" Chapter 2 was the sentence, "Parents typically assume that substantial time is being set aside in school to read." I wrote that it's important to let parents know that students are reading at school, but should be reading at home too. A lot of parents don't read to their students at home, and it just hurts my heart, so that communication needs to be had. This section is where I reacted to the definitions of academic language. First, the one that was academic language is the language of books, and then the other one that was a little bit more complex. I really liked the shorter definition. I think it worked better for if I were to use it with children, but I also noted how the second definition feels like the adult version of the definition. Both of those really stood out to me because I had never thought about academic language in such a short one sentence kind of answer. This is now on to chapter 3. This was talking about concept mapping and why it was good for ELLs. And the text said, using it as a resource to guide them in understanding the precise nature of the relationships between concepts. And I had a question. I said, do students ever just make the concept map and copy from the text without understanding? If so, how do we stop that from happening? That was something that really bugged me when I read about concept mapping because I think that it's an amazing idea. It's just all those little tiny details bother me. On page 54 of chapter 3, I was reading the section about headings, and it said, "Headings alert readers of what to expect, but not all readers understand this fact." And I said, this activity can work as a formative assessment to see if the students understand that headings alert readers of what to expect. We talked about formative assessment before, and I'm always trying to think of new ones just so that I'm ready for when I am going to be a teacher, and so I identified this one, and I think that it would work really well with this activity. The next part that I highlighted was, I have it on my post-it note as page 68. It was actually 69. It was talking about the trifecta. And so it says, as a teacher, it's always a good idea to view your activities through this lens after initial planning, meaning understanding what your students need to read, write, and talk about. And so I said, this is kind of like viewing the lesson via the objectives, meaning what the students will be able to do once the lesson is over. Objectives are really important, and so knowing what they have to read, write, and talk about can coordinate really well with the objectives. Going back to page 45, the next part that I talked about actually had two different comments that I think go together. One of them was an exclamation point kind of one, and then the other one was more of a thought. And so the text says, unfortunately, what's likely to happen once ELLs exit pull-out programs is that they will have reached their highest level of academic performance at this point of exit. I said, what? I never knew this. I always thought learning would continue. And then down below it says, English language learners who have attained conversational proficiency and have been exited from ESL pull-out programs are often seen by teachers as not needing linguistic support once they pass the most obvious initial stages of language development. And I just wrote, my earlier thought confirmed this. Now I feel bad. Because this is honestly the thinking that I had. I believed that once they exit those programs, they don't need as heavy supports as they would have before because those programs are usually intensive. At least I believe that they are. And so my thinking has definitely changed based off of this page. Moving on to chapter 4, my first thought was from the section about empathy. It says, though we generally view empathy as a very good thing, when poorly channeled, it can often lead to low expectations that directly limit the types of learning opportunities to which ELLs are exposed. I wrote, low expectations can be so hurtful to students who need a challenge. There are plenty of ELL students who definitely do not want or who may not need the challenge at a certain time. However, there's definitely ELL students who are feeling like they have a lot of knowledge and just everything that they have to offer, and they can't actually offer it up because they don't have the language skills, and so those low expectations that teachers place upon them are very harmful. My next quote was from a actual quote that says, "If I keep probing and probing, I can sense their frustration," and that was on page 88 of chapter 4. And I wrote, "I've had this happen with an ELL before." In my soft block placement, there was a couple students in my classroom, which was a kindergarten classroom, and that were ELL students, and one of them in particular spoke pretty much only Spanish. And when my co-op would go and try to ask him questions or get him to follow along, he was obviously very frustrated, and he exhibited behaviors that showed his frustration, like not listening or acting out or trying to answer every question because he wanted to seem like he knew something. And it took me trying to talk to him in extremely broken Spanish for him to actually take a breath on one day and try to follow along. And so I felt so bad for him because I could tell that he's constantly being probed at, and there's just a constant frustration there, which I definitely do not want to have with my future students. My next comment was from page 91 on chapter 4. It says, "By ensuring individual thinking time before asking an ELL to share with the whole class, the student has much needed time to process both the question and the answer." And I wrote a thought and I said, "Also more inclusive for students with disabilities." I plan on becoming at least a teacher for a general education inclusive classroom. However, I do really see myself becoming a special educator at some point in the future, and so I'm always looking out for students with disabilities who always need or who just want the extra time to process the questions and answers so that they can put their best work out there. And so extra time can benefit not only ELLs but also students with disabilities. My last comment from the LRC in chapter 4 was on page 102. The text says, "The practice in back and forth dialogue with respected peers and the confidence to say something insightful and meaningful is integral in developing higher order thinking." I wrote, "Confidence is one of the most important parts of speaking academically." There was a lot in this text, of this textbook, about academic speech and how to help ELLs feel confident about speaking academically, and so I just wanted to reiterate how that's something that I really prioritize as a teacher, especially with students who are ELLs or who may have disabilities, because I want to make sure that they're having the same opportunities and getting the same supports that they would need so that they can start speaking academically and be respected for it. The next section in the TPT book is chapter 9. On page 139, I underlined the sentence, "At its finest, formative assessment engages students in taking ownership of their own learning and in their own self-improvement." And I wrote, "Students should always be able to tell what they need to work on with the thumbs up symbol, just because formative assessment is meant to help a teacher know what the students know and how the teacher can help the students. But I also think it's really important for students to be given opportunities where they can assess their own learning and understand how their learning can be improved and how they can make that happen." This next one was on page 141 of TPT in chapter 9. It was just a quick question about the chalkboard splashes. In the section where it says, "They then walk up to the whiteboards and in various sections jot down their understandings of each form." I asked, how do we keep track of what each student says? Since chalkboard splashes can be used as formative assessments, I was just curious about how teachers can keep track of all of what the students are saying, since it's going to be many students at one time going up to the board. My next comment was a heart on page 143. It was talking about the one-liner wall. I just loved this overall concept so much. I think that a lot of teachers do like vocabulary walls or our best work kind of walls, but I really like the idea of a one-liner wall also being implemented in the classroom, just because it can help so many students actually learn rather than just looking at singular words or what amazing things their peers did. On page 144 of the TPT book in chapter 9, I underlined part of the sentence from, "If we see the purpose for assigning grades as an attempt to accurately portray a student's status on a continuum of learning, then it makes sense to include what we discover through total participation techniques in student learning," or grading. I put a thumbs up there. I said, "Progress reports or use of Seesaw are perfect for letting parents know how their students are doing," just because it's good to keep track of student progress, but then it's also really great to let the parents and families know how their students are doing and how they're using those amazing TPT techniques. Going into Chapter 10, on page 147, there's the quote, "Do other teachers know that you're this deep?" The student responded, "No, I don't think so." I did a heart and I wrote sad. It's good that this student can open up in her class, though. It really made me sad that this student doesn't get recognized for the amazing work that they can do in other classes, but it really did make my heart happy to know that at least one teacher is recognizing it, because all it takes is one teacher to be the kindness that a student may need to still feel motivated to try. On page 148, I noted Courtney Sislow's grouping method, where she allowed students to choose their own groups, grouping students strategically and grouping students heterogeneously. And I put a thought bubble and I said flexible seating would work well with all of those, because even if you're grouping students in groups that you make rather than letting them choose, they can still have some kind of choice by choosing where they want to sit, which can help with student motivation a lot. My next comment was on page 150. It was about the paragraph that was at the bottom of page 150 that goes into 151. It was about the teacher going around and validating student answers and just encouraging them. And I like this idea a lot, and I think that I will definitely be doing this. But because I think of little details, there was a little worry in my head about what if a student becomes discouraged from working because the other students are thinking that they're some kind of teacher's pet. And that's just something that I definitely fear, because I remember when I was in elementary school, I was called a teacher's pet here and there for trying really hard and then getting praise. And so I don't know how to combat that and help students go through that. My last comment from Chapter 10 was on page 156, which is the last page of Chapter 10, and it says, the first thing you do when you shoot somebody down is that they shut down. And I wrote that I've seen this too much, especially in my field placements. I have been around co-ops that will be quick to tell their student to stop doing something, or even to, go sit down at their desk and put their head down. And it just made me think about how the student will just shut down then, and then won't want to try for the rest of the day because they've already been yelled at or scolded way too much. And so, even though it's a sad thing to end the chapter on, it just made me think like, oh, I'm never going to be that teacher. And this video and the book and honestly everything is just something to hold me accountable for that.